biomechanics, biohacking, Dianetics. Which of the three is actually valid? We're going to discover in this episode today.
Yep, this episode on L. Ron Hubbard, the modern savior for us all. Shout out. Oh, wait, sorry. Apparently, I'm getting a phone call from our producer.
Oh.
The answer is biomechanics. And that's actually what we're going to be discussing today. Apologies.
And Eric, maybe we got some individuals that one, Vigotsky's pursuing his PhD. Megan has her PhD. Maybe she has a company or a program, Kinetic Advantage, that helps lifters most take advantage of their biomechanics in order to optimize their lifts. So we have two very qualified people to talk about a topic everyone's interested in. What else is new on iron culture?
Yeah, and one of them happened to have competed at the world level in the IPF.
Yeah.
I wonder sometimes if our listeners get tired of hearing from these elite level competitors who also happen to have like doctorates and a wealth of experience and are extremely good critical thinkers. Like, maybe we just need to get on some biohackers. Maybe we need to get on some people who can give them the one true answer to nothing so that they can do the one thing that will help them spend some money right now instead of like make progress.
Eric, I was disappointed, and it was much to my despair that I did not hear one biohacking tip. And I just want to say publicly on behalf of both of us that we will try better to get better guests, better qualified, not on the topic, but on how to buy things and how you can contribute your money. We made maybe a minor mention on the previous episode about an OnlyFans account, and that is us keeping with the times. Look forward to GoFundMe. Someone said, truthfully, actually, which is funny, Eric, we turn our advertisements, if you're watching the video, they automatically populate due to YouTube. And I think it's YouTube that's hard up, because in the last episode, we don't change. I actually post the videos, and we don't change, just to talk a little bit about iron culture to the iron culture enthusiasts. It's not like we select, hey, we want more ads. It's a default setting. And so YouTube, for some reason, has doubled the amount of ad placements inside the video. You can, of course, listen on audio on Spotify, on iTunes if you're here now on YouTube to avoid that. But I find it just funny. We didn't think to ourselves, yeah, dog, let's make some more money right now. YouTube is honestly probably hurting. And so because they make basically the same amount of revenue or more that we generate from these videos. So like, yeah, let's put like 30 more ads on this video right here.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if anyone needs to donate some money to a needy cause, I would definitely look for places where you can just send YouTube money. Maybe actually go out and just watch ads. Skip through the actual content.
Yeah.
If you look at the bottom and you see the little yellow dashes, just skip to each yellow dash, watch the ad, buy something, really help out the little guys like, YouTube and the people who are selling you their $1 million investing course and master classes on things that you don't need to learn. But anyway, this episode, speaking of master classes, I'm going to segue myself. I would say this is a master class on biomechanics for lifting. We got from Kinetic Advantage, formerly Dr. Megan Bryanton, now in a transitionary state from Dr. Megan Bryanton-Jones, and will eventually, as she said, become fully Dr. Jones. She's done some critical work in the areas of sit and stand research in the elderly, and also the biomechanics of lifting. And now what she regularly does is she takes top-level lifters and coaches for their athletes and helps them understand from a biomechanical perspective and analysis of their lifts, which results in suggestions as to which accessory movements they should use. Sometimes technique adjustments if warranted, but most of the time helping them better in the technique that they have. And also providing them potential cues to help them reach a better performance. So in this episode, we talk about that, and we also have Andrew Vigotsky coming back on the cult for the second time. Highly intelligent individual, background in biomechanics, currently studying neuroscience. And he's also got huge biceps, something that we still hold a grudge against him for, as he openly admits that he's not obsessed with lifting, yet Greg Knuckles has it on good authority that he looks better than either I or Omar. So we have a problem with that. And we let him know that. Probably taking up more of the listeners' times than they'd appreciate. So anyway, if you want to learn about the biomechanics of lifting, you come to the right place.
Yeah, I actually think that we do a very good job, and yes, this is self-congratulatory, of keeping it conversational while also going in depth, Eric. Because Andrew managed not to say pennation angle or innervation in this episode, but they go deep. So if you're interested in biomechanics or just becoming a better lifter, a stronger lifter, this is for you. But Eric manages to dial it back, reframe and rephrase certain things so it is at once understandable to the masses. So we go deep, we go wide, and we go everywhere in between. I think as we kind of allude to in the episode, we certainly want to have some sort of follow-up or another episode as it relates to hypertrophy, because there's still so much nuance to talk about when we talk about biomechanics.
Absolutely. Well said. And with that, we'll get into it.
Comrades, we're united here today with one cause, one lift to rule them all. And that's why we brought some people that know biomechanics, because Eric, we already know the answer. There's only one type of squat that you should be doing. Anything else makes no sense. I just want to give a quick shout out to one of our guests right now, the two-timer right now, Andrew Vigotsky, who just came back from the Tour de France. He has actually his bicycle in the background, made time for us. And I just want to say, Eric, that the answer, really the only acceptable answer on Iron Culture, what's the best squat, is, of course,
bicep curls.
Yeah. And we're just happy everyone's on here to confirm what we already know. So yeah, is that how we kick it off, Eric? Is that what we do?
Yeah, I think it's pretty solid. Our tagline here is culture, history, and confirmation bias.
Yeah.
So we're ready to rock. We have people to help us extend our platitudes with pseudoscience, and I'm confident that we can sell an ebook based on this episode alone. And of course, you will both get a one-time commission fee that will end up frustrating you when you see how much money Omar and I make. And the things we buy with it frivolously and that we post on Instagram. Which that's the main reason, Andrew, you need to get an Instagram account, is so that when you have your $250 work for hire payment, you can see me and Omar having these 1990s era rap video style posts.
Yes.
With like jet skis and egregiously disgusting like kinds of parties that we're putting on. Yeah. And you're just looking at that check so you can post about it and be mad. So think about the future. It's bright.
Megan, welcome on Iron Culture. Glad to have you on.
Thank you.
This is what you have in store for you. So
I was like, I just in my head, like, what have I gotten myself into?
That is our goal. Yep. That is our goal. You're like, hold on, I thought we were going to talk about biomechanics. Oh no, not at all. So yeah. So second time on, Andrew Vigotsky. Thank you for coming back on. Thank you for making the time. First time guest, and I'm going to say long time listener. Please don't correct that. Dr. Megan Bryanton-Jones, correct?
Yes.
So if people look at you in the PubMeds, they might see Bryanton, but now it's Bryanton-Jones. Could you
I'm in
please...
that transition where I'm going Bryanton-Jones, and then I'm going Jones in brackets, and then eventually it will be Jones. But my research is under Bryanton. I went from being the only Megan Bryanton in the world to the most generic Megan Jones in the world. So it's a hard transition.
Well, welcome, Dr. Future, brackets from hashtag to the dash to eventually just Dr. Jones. Could you do us the pleasure of telling us a bit about your background? As I understand it, you've competed in powerlifting. You've worked with some of the leaders in the weightlifting world as far as academia. You've done yourself a master's, PhD, and now you have Kinetic Advantage. You're doing a lot of cool stuff. Tell us more about yourself, please.
Yes, you summarized it pretty good. I started competing back in 2007 when it was just primarily equipped lifting, and back in Prince Edward Island, Canada. Training with the boys and learning things through word of mouth. And then eventually I got to the point where I realized I wasn't lifting how I should be lifting. And I went to grad school because there was nothing else to do with a biology degree. And my mom is a university professor of nursing. So I was like, oh, let's try grad school. And I went towards physical education, recreation, because I was powerlifting. So I wasn't just a lab geek that decided to dabble in weightlifting or powerlifting. It was the other way around. It was selfish. I wanted to learn more and get stronger. And then I'm a bit of an all or none person. So I got to the point when I got to my PhD that I had to choose between training consistently or academia. And I know Andrew can attest to that right now. You kind of get consumed by PhD in grad school. And then after I was done and I defended my dissertation, I came out and I was doing my postdoctoral fellowship. And it was like I came out of the lab and it was a whole new world of powerlifting, and it was popular, and people were posting this stuff on social media. And I would just get so frustrated, and I feel like, okay, I don't want to be a troll. Like I'm a very non-confrontational person. I'm actually, pretty shy. I don't like confrontation, but so I was like, okay, well, maybe I should be posting stuff instead of just complaining about it. And then whenever I started doing that, people were interested, and I'm like, holy, people don't know this stuff. Like I kind of took it for granted that everything I learned over the past decade was common knowledge. I think that's part of the imposter syndrome with grad school. You don't realize that maybe you have achieved something. Like even now when you call me Dr. Jones, it still kind of like throws me off a little bit. So I was like, okay, with my postdoctoral fellowship, you don't make a lot of money. You're basically like how many hours you work versus what you get paid is below minimum wage. And I needed supplemental income. I started Kinetic Advantage Consulting, and it got to the point where I was able to leave my postdoc and go full force into KC. And then it's actually helped me build some credibility, even in academia still. So, with different, being a co-editor on textbooks and stuff like that, like doing podcasts like this, when you do a job interview, employers are going to these sources of information. So my foot's still in the door. I'm still teaching, but majority of my time is with Kinetic Advantage. And what I do is I consult with different lifters and coaches. I provide biomechanical breakdowns of their lifting technique, stressing it's not a critique. It is an assessment. And that is something I'll say over and over again. It is assessing why they move the way they do, explaining to them their muscle strategies, and then developing a game plan in terms of accessory movements to bring up their strengths, weaknesses, or developing, better technique cueing.
Right. I love it. Yeah. I just to kind of show the 7 degrees or 6 degrees or how many degrees of separation there are to Iron Culture guests and our lovely community that we're building. I was on Instagram, and my very good close friend and my longest time athlete and also colleague, having started the Strength Athlete, Bryce Lewis, was posting how you're going to do an assessment of his squat. And I was like, who dare touch my athlete? No, I'm just kidding. I was like, oh, very cool. And I followed the rabbit hole back, and I started looking at your stuff, and I thought, this is really neat. This is cool. I remember this name. Oh, yeah. She was on that publication with Vigotsky. And then I was like, hanging out, looking through things. And lo and behold, my good friend Mike T, you were on a podcast with him. I listened to you talk. I listened to the whole thing. I was like, this is great. And I was like, fingers crossed. I hope she says yes. I hope she comes on the culture. So welcome. Thank you. I really want to get into what it is you do, the experience of getting an assessment from you. What's that like? And then what tools can you give a lifter and a coach? I think that's really a unique thing that's going on. That's not something at all that I think most lifters know they can't even do or get access to. And then understanding how that works. Absolutely. What information they get. I think we can spend a lot of time getting into that. Andrew, you've been on here twice, not 3 times. So you're like mid-tier level friend of the culture. So we'll allow you to do a brief introduction. Okay. I know you tend to drone on and really try to build yourself up.
He deserves it.
Yeah, he's one of the more arrogant people I've met in life. So we're going to give you a solid maybe 30 seconds to introduce yourself and just try not to take too much of our time. Okay, please.
Yeah, and Andrew, sorry, just before you go on, I want to say that if we sound at all jealous of you in any way, shape, or form, it is totally not because myself and Eric remember very pointedly what one Greg Knuckles said about you, and that is you were wearing actually a hoodie on the previous episode, and Greg said, without any joke, he's like, Andrew's biceps are bigger than both yours, Omar, and Eric's. I've seen all you in person. And so what we just said has no reflection upon how we treat you as a person. So please, just maybe at this point, I've been interrupting your introduction, so we'll just move it down to 10 seconds. The floor is yours, my man.
Yeah, you introduced his biceps, which is probably one of his most impressive aspects of his
Well,
personality, life, and soul. So you can go from here. You already took care of part of it.
well, thank you for the unbiased introduction. I'm Andrew. So I actually got into strength training and all of that. I was originally a software engineer, and I was bodybuilding at the time. And like Megan, I wanted to know more about what I was doing. Yes, exactly, Eric. So I decided to go back to school for kinesiology. So I did my undergrad, or I finished my undergrad in Arizona, and there I did some research. So with Brett Contreras, and also I worked with local faculty. And then after I finished, I did some research with Brad Schoenfeld in his lab. And then I went to grad school for biomedical engineering, and that's where I am now. So I did my master's in biomedical engineering in biomechanics and musculoskeletal modeling. And I did a master's in statistics. I'm still waiting for that degree. And now I'm finishing my PhD in biomedical engineering with a focus on computational neuroscience and pain neuroimaging. So I'm not really in this area anymore, but a lot of my formal training is pretty rigorous in biomechanics, and that's kind of where my primary expertise is, I'd say.
And we won't let go of you. You're just, like you were like, I'm going to do this stuff with Brett Contreras and Brad Schoenfeld. And you're like, wow, this is really lowbrow science. I got to get out. And then you keep getting these emails. We need you on Iron Culture. We're going to keep your brain. And you're like, oh, you people who lift weights.
Andrew is an expert in critical thinking. That is
well
what you
said.
need him for.
100%. I totally, and that's honestly, I've had, I have light bulb moments a lot in my life. That's one of the benefits of being dumb. But I say many of them have come from papers I've read of yours, perspectives you've given, and things that I'm like, man, I would otherwise never think of that. And it has to do with your work in this area. So in all seriousness, I greatly respect your contributions, your intellect, and I very much appreciate you coming on. So I'm excited. I'm looking forward to this discussion. I know Omar is, because Omar's been telling me, hey, man, you got to do low bar squats and nothing else. And I was like, well, why would I do that? Yeah. Because I want to stay more upright so that the YouTube likes me. And it's tough. I get told online I've got a low bar squat, and then I get told online that I'm doing a good morning. And I just don't know. Well, go ahead, Omar.
Eric, I was just going to say, so as you had your mind exploded by Andrew, I had the same thing. I went to a little seminar in Wichita Falls where I learned essentially that there was one movement and one way to do the movement. And every single person, it's a system. And so, Megan, that's why it sounds great. Kinetic advantage. Yeah, movement analysis, trying to optimize someone's movement. They already have it figured out where I went. And the person, he's starting something, if you want to get stronger, it seems like the place to be. I'm not saying right now that I'm going to be skeptical about what both of you say. I'm listening with one ear and I'm actually talking with the other. Yeah.
Got it. So so you're saying that if you're starting strength, there's maybe you need to think about maybe 5 things to do.
Right.
And all 5 are do low bar squats. Is that kind of what you're getting at, Omar?
Yeah, I think that's a slight reduction of the position, but it's a general. Yeah, it generally encapsulates the philosophy. Sure.
I'm amazed by your abilities to just serially come up with so many non sequiturs. It's phenomenal.
The funny thing is it a non sequitur if that is literally the entire podcast? I mean, that's I know that's an existential question, but we won't get too deep. So, okay. The interesting transition from that question, or which wasn't a question at all, is the question: what might determine someone's choice of squat? If that was someone's getting into lifting, they've come from like a general lifting background, so they've done the traditional high bar squats. Like a fool, they've put the bar on their upper traps, and they want to get real strong. And someone tells them, "Hey, let's go into a low bar squat." Is that universally good advice? What is so special about the low bar squat, and what might determine whether someone will experience success with it or not from a biomechanical angle?
So when it comes to a lot of these questions, people are going to get frustrated because I'm going to say it depends a lot. And it depends on the person. So the way that I look at it, so when people say, what is the most optimal technique? It depends on the goal of the task, right? So powerlifting, the goal of the task is moving the most amount of weight possible for your body weight, right? And when it comes to that, you need to be making sure that you're taking advantage of your strongest muscle groups, right? The ones that can produce the more force. And so I see the squat as like a sum between the ankle, the knee, and the hip. And you have to achieve a total of a certain amount of sum to move the bar up for a certain barbell load. And then you have your minimum joint torques at each joint that you have to make sure you achieve. So you can transfer that loading around based on how you choose your technique. So whenever I have a lifter that comes to me and I can see from their movement that they really like to keep their knees forward, whenever you add more load to the bar, like their knees don't come back at all, their knees stay forward, I know right away that their knee extensors are probably pretty damn strong, because the more forward your knees are, the harder the quads have to work for knee extension. So that to me tells me that the lifter has relatively stronger knee extensors probably than their hip extensors. And so for them, choosing a technique that takes advantage of those stronger muscle groups is what I would say. So it's not about that high bar is better than low bar and low bar is better than high bar. It depends on the lifter. And then it's almost like a continuum too. So if you have a lifter who, they start off and they have really strong knee extensors and quads and they stay super upright and they push their knees forward, they can go ass to grass. But then they bang away at strengthening their hip extensors to become more balanced. They'll get to a point where maybe they can switch their technique if something's going to provide a better mechanical advantage. Or they go to the other extreme, and this has happened to me personally. Like I was more hip, extensor, glutes, hamstrings, and then I went more knee extensors, but I was a really pretty squatter, but then I couldn't grind out a lift very well, and as soon as my torso leaned forward, I'd fail. So you can go to one extreme then the other. So if the lifter then goes to the extreme where they just, reinforce the strength of their hips over and over and over again, and they neglect their knee extensors to keep them strong and, up to par, then maybe they will have to switch to low bar. So it depends on how I look at it, the relative strengths and weaknesses between the joints. And how I determine that is I look at how does their technique change as load is increased. If one muscle group is working a lot harder than the other ones, it can only produce so much more force output. And the central nervous system doesn't like probably, making a muscle max out. So it likes to do what's easiest. Sometimes that's not what's best. And so we transfer loading demands to another group, and that change in the kinetics, the joint kinetics, will result in a change in the kinematics. So the geometry, and which is, what we observe in our technique. So if you can stay upright at one load, then you add more load and you start more and more good morning squat up, or the hips shoot back, then that is to say there's a transfer of loading demands. That is the compensation. It's not that their technique sucks and it's breaking down. It's just that they're using a different strategy to get the bar up. So that's what I mean by I don't like calling them critiques. I assess the muscles.
Totally makes sense. And the answer, it depends, quite literally is almost always the answer, unless we're talking about math. But the mark of an expert is if you can say what it depends on. And as someone who's very familiar with depends, because I eat far too much fiber, I can tell you that you did a great job with that, telling us what it depends on.
Thank you.
That was a poop joke, folks. We're pretty sophisticated here in culture. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Andrew, any other thoughts you want to round out as to lift selection in the squat?
The math guy. Like I found whenever we were working on our paper together, I'd like conceptualize, and then Andrew was like that. He would, do the math and, make it actually a real thing, like prove it.
Where are your proofs?
Yeah.
Well, the only thing that comes to mind to kind of complement what Megan said is this idea that each joint has a minimal amount of joint torque that it has to produce for a given point in the movement. So that's the net torque that it has to produce. But since some of the muscles that are contributing to this movement do cross multiple joints, and because there are multiple joints involved, it makes the work contribution from each of the muscles a bit more difficult. So for example, because you do have hamstrings and they're going to be contributing at the hip, that means the quads might have to do more to overcome the knee flexion moment that the hamstrings produce. So it's really about also finding a balance between these muscles that actually counter each other and what they can do. So on the muscle level, it's not exactly a sum. On the joint level, it's exactly a sum.
It has to be, right? That totally makes sense. I think understanding that what is going on internally to produce the external force may not be expected is where a lot of the biomechanical mistakes come from. I think a really good, and by mistake I mean suppositions that we carry in the S&C world. Because the beautiful thing about being a PhD in S&C is you don't have to be smart. You just have to know enough to be wrong about everything a little bit. So for example, Megan, you were talking about how during your PhD you had to stop training as much and focus because it was a difficult, PhD. My PhD, I spent most of the time learning to count to 10. And then I had the sufficient math to do my PhD on RPE, which is a 1 to 10 scale.
There's no zero on that?
No. That's for smart people like Borg, for the original one. So originally I was going to do a 1 to 5 scale. My advisors suggested that was more of a master's level project in S&C. So we kicked it up to 10. Took another year to study, and I got there eventually. But the good news, I was also able to train too hard and get injured in the process. So just, some things it's a piece of advice for your future. But anyway, getting back on task. So some of the common tropes, when I first got into powerlifting, I would read a low bar squat, the most important muscle group. What did they say on West Side? Hamstrings. And that was something that never made sense to me because exactly what you were saying, Andrew, if the hamstrings are really working that hard, wouldn't that cause a problem for the quadriceps? So I guess my question is can we talk about hamstring involvement in the squat? How much can it be? And if you do a low bar, is it a whole lot more? Or are you still kind of running into a problem with that being maybe not actually what's happening in terms of the internal aspect of it, like I mentioned before?
So Megan really pioneered this research, so I'll let her...
The pressure's on. Yeah, so this is something that I'm still fighting against people, with, and they're like, well, no, if it's a multi-joint task and the hamstrings are biarticular, then the rectus femoris is biarticular, then it should cancel out the knee flexion, knee flexor torques that the hamstring's pulling because, the rectus femoris is an extensor, but a hip flexor. But Andrew, I will give him credit for all of the math that he actually modeled it out. He used the research from my master's and took it, instead of just looking at the knee extensor torque and the hamstrings, he took it to another level and did the glutes, adductor magnus, hamstrings, rectus femoris, vasti, and broke it down even more. But what we found was, like he was saying, we need the net. Any joint torque we measure is a net torque. So it is the plus and the minuses. We never just have an agonist muscle, contracting on its own. There's always co-contraction going on. And it depends. And that's one of the benefits of strength and conditioning or strength training is you get reduced levels of co-contraction. So, that is kind of like your first red flag. It's okay. An adaptation for strength training is reduced co-contraction, but I want to get the hamstring stronger, which will cause more co-contraction. So that is the first thing you got to think about. The next is if I published a paper on, it's called hip extensor strategy. It'll influence the knee extensor torque, the net torque there. So we can, have the glutes contracting on its own. We can have the glutes and the hamstrings. We can have the glutes, hamstrings, adductor magnus. We can have the glutes, adductor magnus. We could model all those different combinations. All three of them are hip extensors. The problem is the glute is the only really monoarticular, just crossing posturally behind the hip. So I think of it as like the powerhouse for hip extension, where the hamstrings, what Andrew and I found was they get recruited more and more as load gets heavier. The adductor magnus, it was more of a depth effect. So the adductor magnus highly underestimated hip extensor and deep hip flexion. But we know the adductor magnus, based on its name, probably one of the biggest mislabeled names out there. With the new research coming out, and people just still fight me on this, and it's actually probably the primary hip extensor and deeper hip flexion. The glutes aren't good at producing hip extensor torque and deep hip flexion, which is the bottom of the squat. So you have all of these different muscle strategies, and you can use all these different combinations. And in my experience, it depends on the tension in it, or the relative strength in it. So if you're always sitting back in the squat and you're always putting tension in your hamstrings, that tension, whether it's, from just the stretch or the hamstrings contracting because they're being recruited to assist the glutes, there's going to be increased knee flexor forces from the hamstrings that the quads will have to counteract. And so I think of it as very inefficient. The squat, it's supposed to be a simultaneous movement. We come up, with simultaneous hip and knee extension. The deadlift is different. We get knee extension, then hip extension. But based on that, the hamstrings are supposed to be isometrically active. They're not actually changing in length based on how they cross the joint. So whenever I have a lifter and, they've been cued to, push their hips back, put their weight on their heels, and, they're really putting a lot of tension in their hamstrings. And then if you chronically train like that, we know that if you train a muscle group, it's going to get stronger. If it's working harder, it's going to get stronger. And then what happens with these lifters is that strength gets reinforced more and more. You're training it more at a higher percent MVC. It gets stronger. It contributes more to the lift. And then you get to this point where the glutes just kind of take this backseat role, and you're all hamstrings. And then you lose, it's just chain reaction. Then you lose your pelvic control, and then you're bracing. It's something that I actually, have a lot of lifters that come to me with knee pain, and they're like, no matter what I do, the knee pain keeps coming back. I push my hips back more and it relieves it temporarily, but then it keeps coming back. It's because you push your hips back, and you immediately reduce the knee extensor demands, torque demands. But then you chronically train the hamstrings more, and then there's more fighting the quads, and then the quads have to work even harder to counteract those stronger hamstrings. And it's just this rabbit hole, and the lifter just can't dig their way out of it. And then they end up, stop competing, or they just have to take time off for that inflammation to go down. So, and even Greg Nuckols is, talked on it's the most overrated muscle, and people will still fight on, no, that's not how it works. It's well, go talk to Andrew, because he modeled it out, did all the muscle modeling, and he's smarter than all of us. And he says, no, it doesn't work out very nicely.
So in the end, we just fall back onto an appeal to authority. The only authority that matters, Andrew Vigotsky, and
exactly.
I think that 100% agree.
The Tour de France winner, that is why he has the authority. I do want to follow up. I was this close, Eric, to talking about winning the hypertrophies with Andrew, because it's real seductive, that line of thought. But Megan said something very interesting that I do want to pursue, and that is, now you've worked with athletes, and so you have a large enough sample size to maybe notice some trends. Would you say, first off, that you've noticed in certain lifters, they almost become efficient with a certain technique that might not be their best technique long-term for their strength development, but they've just invested so much in it that they're getting this return, and so they think, oh, this is my optimal technique, even though that might not be the case?
Yeah, I find that with lifters who, if their hips are relatively stronger, and they really, they squat low bar and they push their hips back, they don't allow the knees to travel forward as much. They're wide stance, and then they don't do any type of accessory work, or they just choose to do accessory work that reinforces their strengths. They get to the point where they just completely neglect their quads, their knee extensors, and these are the lifters where they have problems getting depth. How the muscles contribute, it's different between the hip and the knee. From parallel and deeper you go, the knee extensors are really that make it or break it muscle group. They're not the only contributor, but they're going to depict if they're strong enough to be able to get you out of the hole. So if you just keep your regular training is always reinforcing your stronger muscle group, which makes sense because you choose a technique that allows you to use it. But then if you just completely neglect the other ones, then you're going to get to that point where you can't maintain that net amount of knee extensor torque, especially if you are reinforcing the strength of the hamstrings and the quads just can't even produce enough force as is to begin with, to maintain that, requirement at the knee. And then you have the hamstrings fighting them. And then I find these are lifters where they put like 5 kilos on the bar and then they completely fail because the quad's just like, no, I can't do it. Or they get too parallel and they're in competition and then they get like one or two lights or maybe one light, and then they have to go a little bit deeper, and it just seems like half an inch, and then all of a sudden they completely fail. It looked really easy when they hit parallel, and then they have to go a little bit deeper to get 2 white lights, and then they just fail, and people are like, what the hell is going on? And I see that as just a knee extensor weakness, or that the fact the knee extensors aren't super weak, but they just can't fight the hamstrings like they have to.
Yeah, I was going to say that following up on that, now compared to probably when you were powerlifting, where shout out to Sean Kelly, who owns Forest Fitness, that man's an OG where he's been competing for honestly 20 some odd years. As you said, where there's only equipped, like that's all you could do. So he kind of comes from that West Side life. But now over the last several years, we see a lot more individuals doing a sumo deadlift. I could say probably on the bench press, experimenting with bench press grip width, where there's a lot of, we're speaking specifically kind of IPF trends, USAPL, those lifters, slightly wider grips. Can you speak in a very generalized way without giving any of the secrets of kinetic advantage, some of those trends? Let's say like, oh, these are some common observations we tend to make amongst this, pretty competitive group of lifters that come in, whereas like, they think, oh, like, yep, sumo deadlift, I got to go for that super wide stance. You're like, actually, when I take a look at things, that might not be the case. Can you just go over some of those common things that you're maybe seeing on a regular basis that maybe the, cultural zeitgeist that's occurred when it comes to powerlifting has shifted it in that way, and maybe there needs to be a correction?
Yeah, I can definitely touch on the OG time because, like I said, I started equipped, and with equipment, you're always getting the assistance in the hole. So I was always kind of loading up the top end of my range of motion, whether it's squat, bench, or deadlift. I always lifted sumo. And bench was my best because I had a really, big arch. So I reduced the range of motion a lot. I went super wide because I'm like only 5'3". And I went as wide as I could. So it was all about, getting that mechanical advantage and taking advantage of the equipment. But like I could squat 150 kilos in a suit, but barely squat 80 kilos raw. Or
Wow.
I couldn't even get depth. And I got to the point where like getting depth was even harder and harder as I went on in my equipped year. And like I almost bombed at Worlds because I couldn't get depth and I was like bawling. And so that was kind of like my realization is like, okay, I need to work on my bottom end strength. What is it that like my bottom end strength isn't there? Why is it getting worse? And then doing my master's research is like, because, I'm constantly neglecting my knee extensors. So with technique and equipped versus classic, I consider them two completely different sports. They're not the same sport. They don't have the same goal. There's moving the most amount of weight possible, and then there's getting stronger, right? Getting your muscle stronger versus just moving weight. So it's shifted, and that's where I mean, like I came out of my rabbit hole of my research bubble, and I was like, oh wow, like classic lifting. I only competed probably like 3 or 4 times raw, but it was just such like a way more relaxing experience. And when I competed raw, classic, I was high bar and I was narrow. I like equipped, I was wide. It was about getting the stretch. And then I learned that, okay, right now I need to select a technique that, takes advantage of my relatively stronger muscle groups. And at that point, I was so devoted to getting my quads stronger that I got to the point where I needed to be a high bar in order to squat as much weight. And I've made the mistakes. And so that's why I'm hoping like telling my story on that kind of helps people because, I herniated a disc in my back about 10 years ago. And that was like my wake up call that, I need to stop listening to what others are telling me to do in the equipped world, and I need to do what kind of makes sense to me. So when it comes to, and I've made a few posts on this, the ghosts of equipped lifting's past, and how it's still haunting us now, and the lats and the bench press and going as wide as you can sumo, like you mentioned. Whenever I think of sumo deadlift, I think about ground reaction forces, and when we push down the world pushes back at us, and we want to make sure that we're pushing down and they're coming back at us in the direction that we want to move the bar, and that's vertical. So I find whenever a lifter is going too wide there, and I look at their lower shins, so if their shin is just angled and more horizontal, then that's telling me that their ground reaction forces are being directed in the wrong direction. So it's kind of like looking at it, and it just seems very wasteful, versus if they took it in like a little bit, and then their shins are nice and upright. They're still sumo. They can still go wider and reduce the range of motion and get that, reduce the amount of work. But I find that that's what helps them, push down on the world better, versus going wide. And if you go too wide, and this was something that I experienced myself, that if I was too wide, then I got these hip issues, and I was like, oh, is it just my mobility? But I found it was because I was pushing my feet out, like trying to spread the floor too much. And then my other muscles that were not wanting my feet to slide were contracting, like my groin and my adductors and my hip flexors. And then they just got super irritated. So there's an efficiency aspect of it. But then there's also, the possible hip complications part of it. And so I got to the point where I messed my hips up so much that I could only train conventional. But then I switched to sumo like the last couple of weeks. And again, another mistake I made that I don't want lifters to have to do either. And then, bench press, you go wider and you reduce the range of motion. But if your chest is weak and you go wider, you're putting more of the loading demands on your chest, and instead of taking advantage of your relatively stronger, your triceps. So that's where, I will tell a lifter that, okay, I don't like to mess with technique too much. I'd rather say, okay, if this is how you want to lift, let's get the chest stronger so you can achieve it. But in that moment, like it's a long-term goal, and short-term, they have to decide if you want to commit to a long-term or you want the short-term reward, then we're going to go to a narrower grip. So again, it takes advantage of the relatively stronger muscle groups and making things as efficient as possible.
I love it. That's I think there's just so much gold in what you said right there. And I think some of the heuristics that I use when I try to explain people who use different techniques or different grips is, a lot of the times it is exactly that. It's a balance between reducing range of motion, but then putting yourself in a less biomechanically advantaged position to produce force. And then there is some point that might be optimal for you, given your constraints, moment arms, and muscular characteristics. I think the easiest way to think of it is if you were going to go jump or dunk a basketball, you wouldn't get into a sumo stance, right?
No.
that probably wouldn't help,
Exactly.
But at the same time, if depending on someone's individual biomechanics, if your feet are close together like you might for a jump, reaching down, that's a farther distance to pull. And, what are your relative limb lengths to one another? How strong are your given muscle groups? And it ends up being some collective combination of all these things that produces what's the best technique. And I think everything that I've heard from both of you thus far has been, I would say, a lesson in humility. When you hear people who are suggesting one specific technique is better across the board, and then you come to realize that all the things you think you know are a little bit more complex. Like you think you know anatomy, but the adductor magnus, which you might think might be the main adductor, well, in deep hip flexion, is actually a hip extensor primarily, And then you start to learn, the hamstrings, they contribute to hip extension with the glutes. Well, hold on. A squat is combined knee extension and hip extension, so how does that work? And oh my God, the quadriceps and the hamstrings are not only monoarticular, some of them are actually causing two joints. Oh my God. And the next thing you know, you have to stop praying to all the gods that you might have put on a pedestal. And perhaps you don't go back to Wichita Falls, but you go into greener pastures. So
Yeah.
It's a lot of shots being fired.
Yeah,
Apologies.
and
But I think it's important.
I've been having people come at me for saying these things, and they're usually people who've been in the industry for a while, and they don't like what I have to say, and that is honestly the only reason why I put doctor beside my name on Instagram, because I got a comment being like, "Oh, hun," I'm like, "Don't call me."
wow.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. And it's still there on one of these posts, and I'm just like, "Are you kidding me?" It was kind of like, you know what? Like, I deserved my spot at the table. You don't know who I am. You don't know what I know. So I 100% feel you on that one.
Yeah.
Well, I tell you what, I personally like being called hun. It happens so rarely. And maybe I should take the doctor off of my Instagram profile so I can get more of that. That's the main thing I'm learning from this
Unfortunately,
discussion.
you build too much of a name for yourself, so there's no
Damn it.
turning back.
Yeah.
Maybe if I could just put my name as like hun on Instagram.
Yeah.
And then
Call
maybe
me
I'd
honey.
get what I need.
Eric Hunt.
Yes. Ooh, I need a second profile.
Yeah.
This is a rabbit hole that probably is going nowhere except to my own embarrassment. So, Andrew, any other thoughts on everything that's been said thus far? You're like, no.
He's like the amount of non sequiturs you guys managed to do.
Well, so with the adductor stuff, the evidence that it actually is, or may even be primarily a hip extensor rather than an adductor, is overwhelming. Even if you go back to some of the classic neurophysiology literature from the 40s, where they're looking at the actual circuits in the spinal cord, it actually behaves more like a hip extensor. So it's so if you look at these like cross extension reflexes and things like that, and reciprocal inhibition, these sort of intrinsic reflexes that occur in the spinal cord, it acts like an actual hip extensor. And these reflexes aren't there for abductors and adductors. So I think there's also some physiological evidence that this is the case. It's not purely mechanical and anatomical.
I think that's really helpful. And I'm really glad we've got you on coming from the neuroscience side of it, because figuring out what might be the best biomechanical pattern for someone and then actually making those changes, I sometimes feel like that is quite the gap to leap sometimes in practice, especially with a trained athlete who has an ingrained motor pattern. So what you were saying, Dr. Jones, about how you like to work with what they're already doing and then try to make them stronger in those positions, I think in some ways, no pun intended, is the path of least resistance. And that trying to get a high-level lifter to totally change a muscle, a motor pattern, is sometimes extremely challenging. So I was thinking, unless Omar, you wanted to say something before we go on about what do these assessments lead to, and then how do we go about changing patterns in lifters?
No, I kind of just wanted to echo. You joked about your hip, my man, with the what is it, FAI, where you needed the
have that,
the surgery, and then Megan kind of sharing her equipped lifestyle and what happened with her lifts. It's kind of interesting where these old adages that just don't seem to die. When I got more traditionally into powerlifting, when I joined, and it was nobody's fault. There's not one particular person. It's just around that time what people were saying. When you want to get strong, you low bar squat. And when you low bar squat, how low do you want to put the barbell? I was told where it's very uncomfortable. Like, that is actually exactly what I was told. When you think it's low, it's not low enough. I'm like, okay. And then it's like, well, now how should I be squatting? And like, well, you want to sit back. Exactly what you said, Megan. So I'm taking like just a individual that did some sprinting in high school, college. I liked high bar squats, just felt pretty comfortable. And then I went from that position to being told, oh, you want to get strong, man? Okay, shift it really low, sit very far back. And I started doing that, and my hips would feel jammed up, and it just would feel very uncomfortable. But there was almost this masochistic, and I don't know if you agree with this, when it comes to some old powerlifting habits where it's like suffering is good, like suffering is a badge of honor.
Yeah.
Like, your hips feel messed up. Oh no, that's a good. That means you're actually working right. And it basically led me down a rabbit hole until honestly, myself and Greg, when we started working together. And we're just talking a bit, and I saw actually his squatting style when I met up with him in person, where it's super kind of wide and angled out his feet. And I said, wow, man. Like, and at the time, I think he was 242. He set a record, and we just began talking. And he brought up the adductor Magnus. And it kind of was this liberating feeling. It's like, I don't have to do it this way, because it was painful at that point to be lifting, right? You never want to be put in this place where you like to lift, you want to get stronger, but the thing that you're doing just doesn't feel good on your body, yet you're being told by those that have more authority. And
it's called an abusive relationship, and we've talked about this.
Yeah. Eric's like, you could just call me out, bro, if you said that. You're like, yeah, it hurts. Yeah, keep doing it, bro. I was like, okay. So it's just funny, all our own individual journeys. It's almost like the best practices that we want to employ now are almost to prevent people from going down the experiences that we had, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with that. That's what I mean. Like when I hurt my back, it was actually because of a bad spot. It wasn't a chronic thing. It was a quick and painful experience. And I had some glute inhibition, or, you know, the impinged nerve. It's just like I couldn't even engage my glute properly on one side for, you know, a good couple months, and it was painful and causes all the other pains down the line. And then I remember I had such bad hip flexors that my master supervisor, Lauren Chu, is like, you could have like a femoral nerve impingement or something based on how like messed up your hips are. And he would force me to try and squat upright, and like even just like a single leg lunge with pushing my knee forward, and I'd collapse over. And he's like, how have you not used your quads for so many years squatting? And I was like, it was equip lifting. And then it just like, it completely messed up my movement strategy. Going back to what you're saying about, you know, your motor strategy, you're good at what you do, right? What you practice the most. And sometimes, and I've had some lifters like this, and they keep playing around with their stance and then their shoes, and then they just like nothing seems to work. And it's like, well, because you're going to get a temporary decline in performance whenever you switch your movement. Yeah, it's a squat, but you're using completely different muscle contributions and coordinations. And so yeah, you may change your feet out, but then you're going to get this temporary decline in performance. But if you stick with it, you're going to get better at what you practice. Is it the long term, you know, what you should be doing? Depends on your relative strengths and weaknesses. Depends again. But yeah, it's what you practice. You're going to reinforce it, and you get the muscle stronger. The central nervous system's like, okay, I want to use this muscle. It's strong. So then you use it more, and then you reinforce it even more and more as time goes on. So lifters who are lots of hamstrings, it takes a lot of time, and something that I found that works with them, especially with knee pain, and the adductor magnus even. Like I have some lifters that like, they don't even know how to engage their glutes, and then we do some like myofascial release of the adductor magnus, and they stand up and they're like, holy shit, like I can feel them. Like, what is this? What is this like magic? And then they go and they do their workout, and they're like, oh, but I lost it. And it's like, well, it's because as soon as you add more load to the bar, the muscle is going to be recruited. There's more tension added to it. So that's another rabbit hole of how people use myofascial release improperly, and they think it's one thing, but it's really another. I'm sure Andrew can attest to that as well. So it's just about, you know, we don't realize that we can use these muscles, and that they're working a lot more than we think they are, and they have other consequences if their primary action isn't just hip extension or knee extension. And why lifters get their inner thighs get sore when they squat, it's because they use that muscle, and if you use it, it's going to get stronger, and then you're going to use it more and more and more, and then you're going to get to that point where your body wants to keep doing it, and you almost have to figure out this strategy and to fight it and do something completely different. And it's a bit of a long road with some lifters. Some lifters, it's like a immediate switch because they are aware of it and they're like, oh, okay. And then other lifters, they've just gone down that hole for so many years that it's a hard one to dig themselves out of. And I feel like I am that person, despite it's that you wish you knew then what you know now. And maybe I would not be in so much back pain or, hip pain all the time. So, yeah.
Well, I think since we are moving towards kind of what to do and some of the practical aspects of this, let's go down that rabbit hole that you mentioned with myofascial release, because, and this pun is intended, I get triggered when people say myofascial release, because I think it almost tends to imply that something mechanical is happening in the fascia, and that the fascia is in fact being released. So how is that a potential strategy? Because I swear to God, almost every powerlifter does some type of foam rolling or uses a tennis ball. But like you said, I also think many of them don't use it in a way that might be at least facilitative in the long run or for anything purposeful. So talk to me about how you might use that in your practice, and you also hinted that Andrew might have some thoughts, and I'd love to get those as well.
Andrew knows everything about everything, so that's what I mean. And mine is more like I have this theory and I apply it and it works, but I don't know if my theory is correct. So that's why I'm glad Andrew is here. And I admit that, there may be other reasons why it's working. We don't know. Like there's voodoo may work. We just haven't figured out magic yet, and maybe that's why. But yeah, with myofascial release, it's triggering because I think the name, because it's saying, release the fascia. And that's what's increasing range of motion. And unfortunately, there's all these certifications in fascial stretch therapy that people have devoted so much of their time to, and it's like their identity is enthralled in this, this technique that they do. And so if you come up and you say like, well, no, you're not actually doing what you think you're doing, they get so offended because it's a personal attack basically on them. And a really good person to listen to their stuff is the physio detective, and he's kind of like you open your mind to critical thinking. Just kind of name dropping him because I don't benefit from it at all. I've just been listening to his stuff recently, and I'm like, holy crap! Like I still do it. I know I've done it, and I probably still do it. But tangent. With the myofascial release, we think it's like you're kneading the dough, you're making the muscle more soft and supple, and that's what's increasing the range of motion. But anyone with any type of cadaver experience, and they've actually felt this fascia in real life, they'd be like, hey, there's no way in hell that little foam roller is going to do anything to it. That stuff is tough. So during my postdoctoral,
and then if you did, would that be a good thing?
Yeah, it's supposed to it's a container.
So
for
the answer
everything.
is just use a knife, and you can release some fascia.
Yeah. So it was during my postdoctoral fellowship. I did it in somatosensory behaviors, so how our senses can depict our motor strategy. So I did dabble a little bit in motor control. And that's when like my eyes started opening, and I did that fellowship because I know you can't interpret the body as a mechanical system. There's the role of the central nervous system in it, and whether it's the motor output or the sensory input, it'll all influence it. And so it was, kind of taking this basic information from a textbook and just revisiting it and being like, kind of like the light bulbs, like, oh, okay. And then the research coming out, it's actually desensitizing, the sensory receptors or muscle spindles in our muscle to kind of relax their hypertonic kind of contracted state on the muscle. So that is kind of where the direction that I went in. So maybe this ball is, releasing that, contracted state that the muscle wants to be in. And that's how we get increased range of motion and, flexibility, because we know we get increased range of motion from it, but it's not actually because of the mechanical means. It's a neurological relaxation effect. And, someone who specializes in more could have a little bit more insight on it. But with that, and figuring out, okay, why if I release the adductor magnus, I'm not going to say myofascial release, I'll just say release. If I release the adductor magnus, why do my lifters, why do they feel their glutes better immediately? So, and then I was, okay, maybe it's something to do with, some spinal reflexes, maybe reciprocal inhibition. I tried figuring out if we could do a study like that, and basically it's really hard to test in the glutes, or that we didn't have the equipment to do it. So I just continued on my theory, like kept it rolling. And then the next thing that was kind of like putting, maybe I'm on the right track, is, as soon as load is added to the bar or the glutes start fatiguing, the signal from the brain down to re-recruit the adductor magnus will increase. And when that signal increases, it actually causes this increased sensitivity of the muscle spindles. So if you do the myofascial release in your warm-up, by the time you get to your work set, it's completely useless. Like, you wasted your time. It maybe helped you for your first couple of warm-up sets, but by the time you get to your top sets that count, it's, the tension's been added back to the muscle. So, lifters who they've been doing a bunch of clams in their, glute isolation exercises, and then they go and try and squat. They're like, well, my knee valgus is still happening. It's like, well, knee valgus isn't because of the glute med. Maybe in the general population, but my favorite example is my husband. My husband was in a motorcycle accident a very long time ago, and they had to surgically re-put his glutes back onto him. Like, he was pronounced dead on the way to the hospital, kind of messed up. And so he's kind of like my little puzzle piece. And I always thought his glute med was just completely just very atrophied and weak because of some nerve damage. But we really worked on it, and it's actually non-existent, I think. So he doesn't have a glute med on one side. But my husband does not squat with knee valgus. So, and it's that, okay, yeah, you could do clams and work that glute med all day long, but, it's not the cause of your knee valgus, the weakness there. So then I found if you do this release, I keep wanting to say myofascial release, if you do this release in between every couple of work sets, it helps reduce the knee valgus, and it helps keep the glutes engaged better. If the glutes are engaged better, maybe because of this release of the reciprocal inhibition, it's a tension thing, it seems. When there's less tension, the adductor magnus, the glutes are engaged better, and we see less knee valgus. The lifter can push their knees out more, or if they are really consistent and they do this release consistent over the weeks, then the knee valgus is reduced. It's not 100% gone because the adductor magnus is a hip extensor. But to get to the point where it's almost like, it seems like they're knocking out the muscle, and then it's forcing the glutes to do the job. Or it's releasing this inhibition on the glutes, and then the glutes are allowed to do the job. I don't know, because, there's not any studies on it. I would love for someone to do it, Andrew. So that is my current theory. And I'm playing with different ones, but that is kind of the pieces that I'm putting to the pieces of the puzzle that I'm putting together right now. But it's been helping my lifters. Like, when we do this release with the hamstrings and we kind of get the tension out of it and knock it out theoretically, some lifters, their knee pain is gone right away, but then it comes back. Some lifters, they have to do it continuously, and then it eventually goes away if the level of inflammation just needs, time to reside. And I contribute that to maybe, the hamstrings aren't pulling on the knee extensors, the quad, so much that they don't have to, work even harder to counteract those hamstrings. So it does have this some sort of knockout effect by reducing the tension in it. But yes, it is not in the way that people think it is. Back to the beginning of that circle.
No, absolutely. I think most powerlifters are like, I'm tight here, let me just smash it, and actually understanding the mechanism as we best think we know of using a foam roller or a tennis ball or what have you. Then you can start to make some more logical theories like you have. So I think that makes at least it makes sense to me. Andrew, thoughts on potential uses for foam rolling or I'm going to say it, myofascial release?
I don't think a ton about the potential use cases, to be honest. I've been into the mechanisms of it all for a while. I just generally prefer to use the terms massage or manual therapy. There's not as much baggage there.
Absolutely.
For instance, in 2015, a friend of mine and I published a review on the mechanisms or potential neurophysiological mechanisms of different manual therapy approaches. And with a lot of these, you see actual neurophysiological responses such as increased endogenous opioid responses, dopamine, oxytocin, a bunch of different things. It depends on the method and the study you look at. But presumably these different neurophysiological responses will impact the person's perception. And a lot of what we're discussing here are perceptual responses. If you think a muscle feels tight, or if you can feel one muscle more than another muscle, or if you can go through a range of motion now that's more pain-free than before. The fact that these are perceptual responses, it kind of makes the interpretation more difficult in my mind, in that it's not clear that it's a purely mechanical thing, whether we're increasing tension on a muscle or decreasing tension on a muscle, or is it just affecting the focus in a way.
Right.
And there is some literature where they use shear wave elastography on muscles following massage. So I think Erickson Cromert was a paper that came out several years ago, and they saw a decrease in shear wave velocity. So that's indicative of a decrease in either tension or stiffness of the muscle. We don't totally understand shear wave yet. Immediately following the massage, but within minutes, it kind of returns back to normal. So it's kind of, that may corroborate what Megan's saying in a sense, where these effects seem to go away, and maybe there are very, very quick mechanical effects or neurophysiological effects, because the neural signal to the muscle will determine whether or not that muscle is activating and therefore creating tension and stiffness. Or if it's so basically the time course of these things are unclear, and the actual outcomes, be they just purely perceptual or actual mechanical in nature via neurophysiological origins, is kind of unclear to me. Mm-hmm. In a sense, though, just for application purposes, if we are interested in perceptual outcomes, I don't think there's any reason to necessarily shy away from it. Like if this makes you feel good and makes you feel that you can do the movement better, then who cares, so long as there aren't negative consequences of doing it.
Mm-hmm. Or you're
Absolutely.
providing bad information about it, and you're just refusing to. And that's where I'm like, okay, just go back to a basic neurophysiology textbook. And that's what it blows my mind, that these, things have been developed on something that completely conflicts with neurophys, like your basic biology undergrad. Like I went back to my neurophys textbook. I was teaching it to OT students, and I'm like, that's when I was like, I went back to the textbook and I was like, wait a minute, like I forgot about this stuff. And that's what I'm trying to put the pieces of the puzzle. And then it's like, I'm teaching, I'm like, right, if you do this, if a muscle's tight, you're going to interpret it in a longer position, right? Am I getting that backwards? So yeah, if the muscle is tight, then you're going to think that you're at a longer or a more extended joint angle than if it was looser. So, it can be absolutely perceptual. Who knows? But I'm finding doing it this way, it's helping people. I would absolutely, my heart would be broken if I found out that it hurt people. That's where I like to stress to people, I'm not a physiotherapist. I am not anything like that. So it is pretty, theoretical. But that just because the research isn't there doesn't mean we can't pursue something. And sometimes we are really held back on our advancing and strength and conditioning because people are just like, well, there's no studies on it, so I'm not going to do it. It's like, and I was kind of like that as well. It's like, nope, the research says this way, so not going to listen.
It's I totally agree with you. You need to be able to act in the absence of good data, and science is just really high quality observations, but we do observations outside of laboratories. And it sounds like what you're doing, there is a lack of clarity as to the actual mechanism, but it's something emergent from your practice. When I do this seems to consistently happen. If I do it, but it's too long from the actual working set, it doesn't work anymore. I think when you combine that with what may or may not be happening in the end, I doubt there's much risk for harm, given that you're basing this on observed outcomes. So I think the question of whether it's a mechanical or perceptual thing, like you said, Andrew, ultimately probably doesn't matter, especially given that our perceptions influence our motor behavior. Like if you're perceiving pain, you might change your motor pattern, or it might just inhibit the amount of force you can produce, regardless of whether that's a mechanical source of that pain or not. So I think the way one goes about using maybe non-peer reviewed evidence or those casual observations is there's good ways and bad ways to do that. If you're building theory upon theory, and you've got this huge house of cards that aren't really based on what you're actually doing in the field and seeming to work, and you're just telling people to do it because, I don't know, cadavers and anatomy trains, therefore, then yeah, I think you're at risk of doing something negative to people. But when it's kind of this observed response of assessment, tool to use it. Oh, that didn't work. Let's move on to the next thing. Tool to use it. That seems to consistently work.
Don't invest your entire identity into it if it doesn't work the first time.
Absolutely.
The one thing I want to add though is you also have to based on what I'm saying, I'll use it for the hamstrings and the adductor magnus to kind of force maybe the glutes to work harder, to train them. Or, so that we're not reinforcing the strength of the adductor magnus and hamstrings to give the glutes a chance to, get stronger in a more flexed hip position. But you also have to realize, maybe your back's tight, but the last thing you want to do is a myofascial release and of your erectors because they're tight right before you do a heavy squat. So there's time and a place for each one. And that's why I really whenever I make a post on it, I was really hesitant, but people were like, please, okay, I gave in. Please read the comments and the write-up. There's a time and place for different things. Your erectors need to be tight and strong to stabilize your spine. If you go and get all this tension out of it and then you go do a heavy deadlift, you're going to hurt yourself. So that is where I needed to make sure, do my due diligence and say that.
Actually, I'm glad you brought that up, talking about the spinal erectors. This was a bit of a tiny tangent I wanted to go down with the squat and the low bar and the high bar. So Bryce Lewis, squats high bar, one of the few high-level powerlifters who does. And we have tried a number of times to try to go low bar just because on average seems to be able to be bigger squats, right? But that's only if you're very, very powerlifting focused. Once I started to get into weightlifting and see the weightlifting world and some of the crazy squats that you might see some, teenage 52 kilo lifter put up, is incredibly upright, high bar position, no belt or some Valero, Velcro belt or whatever, and rebands that would fall off your knees, is always been really intriguing to me. And one thing I've noticed with Bryce is that he has an incredibly strong back. His spinal extensions seem to be really strong. When he switched from sumo to conventional, the numbers were very, very similar. One just allowed faster recovery and more volume. So we stuck with sumo. And for me, when I used the high bar squat, the thing that seemed to be my limiting factor was I would start to get a concave back and I'd fail. When I switched to low bar, I felt like I was able to maintain a straighter spine, grind through the sticking point, and my numbers went up by about 10%. And with Bryce, it seems like the strength of his back allows him to use a high bar position without necessarily having that as the weak point in the chain, if you will. So that's something I've wondered and hypothesized. Is it that because weightlifters, they train the front squat, they train always being in that position they need to be to get every pull into position to do a snatch or a clean? Is it that they have such strong upper backs that allows them to put up these numbers that most powerlifters wouldn't be able to do because they're front squatting, high bar squatting, snatching, pulling, all that. May be a squatter who would be successful high bar is a component to their back strength.
So I think of it, and that's something I actually never thought about. So thank you. So I had the wheels turning during that. Ultimately, I see if you can push your knees forward more, you got stronger quads and you can stay more upright to keep the center mass over the middle of your foot. If you have it low bar, that means you can afford to have the knees back more to keep the center mass over your foot. And I think with low bar, what you can really do, and what I see with a lot of lifters who are low bar, is they tend to arch their back into the bar more. And it puts the erectors in a little bit of a more shortened position. And that provides them maybe a little bit more of a mechanical advantage versus if they're at a lengthened but actual neutral spine position. And then when it comes to backgrounding, I actually think that more of the time it is nothing to do with back strength. It's to do with your pelvic control. So if you lose and your bum kind of your pelvis extends before your torso does, it's going to give you that, breakdown in the chain, and you're going to get that rounding. You're going to get it at the L5S1, like maybe it carries up the rest of the back. And we know that if you extend the pelvis earlier and you get this rounded back, you're also extending the hip earlier, and you're putting the glutes in a more mechanical advantageous position to produce hip extensor torque, because they're better at doing it in a more extended hip position. So sometimes it's not necessarily the back. It goes down to whether the glutes are doing their job properly, whether you have enough, torso rigidity to control it. And if the bar, if you're more upright, and the bar is in a higher position, then there's more, technically gravitational torques wanting to pull you around too. So, it's probably more challenging to your core stabilizers. And I use the word core just kind of like myofascial release. What is the core? And so I'm just talking about the trunk musculature, but people understand what I'm talking about when I say core. So it may be a little bit of everything. You're shortening the erectors a little bit when you're in a low bar position, but that can cause some rib flaring. And when your ribs are inflared, then you might not be bracing with your abs properly. And if you're not bracing with your abs properly, you're going to lose your control of your pelvis on the anterior side of things, and maybe you'll go into anterior pelvic tilt. And if you're in anterior pelvic tilt, then you can't engage your glutes as best. So there's so many factors. So I can't attest to say why you have a problem with it versus Bryce, but I know Bryce because I've been, not personally, I've never met him before, but I know him on a muscle level because I've been watching his videos pretty much every day. I'm doing that assessment for his lifts that I'm going to post on my Instagram for people. And again, it's going down to explaining why he can lift that way. It has nothing to do with, he would be able to lift more if he was low bar. It's no, he can lift this much and he lifts this way because he has strong quads. He's got strong knee extensors. You watch his knees, they stay forward. And maybe that's what reduces the loading demands for the erectors, because if you're leaned forward more, then it should mean that it should be more challenging to your back. So if you're more upright, it should be less challenging. So it depends on if it's coming from the back or the pelvis.
Yeah, and then it even come down to the different spinal, like the thoracic spinal extensors versus mid-back, low back. The bar is higher up on your spine, but then you're more over. So which one actually produces a longer lever relative to the strengths of the muscles across that whole lever?
Exactly.
So I think that's, there's a lot going on there. Appreciate you indulging that little thought I had.
It's okay.
Absolutely. Andrew, any thoughts or chiming in on that topic before we move on to something Omar is finally going to let him say?
Well, kind of like what you were just saying, there are many moving parts there. And like Megan was saying, it could also be a quad thing. So if somebody's able to use their quads more to presumably stay more upright, then that may alleviate the spine a bit. So it's not really an apples to apples comparison.
But it makes sense why Bryce can't go low bar, because he can't take advantage of his quads, right? Maybe his back isn't as strong as you think it is. I don't know.
I don't know anything about Bryce or his lifts.
He can deadlift 800 pounds.
He's a very strong guy, and people are like, how does he stay so upright? How does he get squat so deep? And,
how dare you squat over 700 pounds high bar? That's not allowed. Yeah. So.
But so that's just a number to me. I don't
It's a lot.
Eric's like, that is my life's work you just insulted, but you're a guest, so I'll pretend like it's no big deal.
Where's I going?
Tell me the Newton force and specific joint angles. This means nothing to me. Yeah.
I do know some people in the past have speculated about, like you were just saying before, Eric, the low bar versus high bar, perhaps relating to differences in thoracic versus lumbar spine strength. But if you look back to the paper that we published, we do talk about spinal strength and its relation to actual ability to squat. And although there is a correlation, we looked at our study compared to other studies in the literature, And a lot of people seem to have the strength, the erector strength to squat more than they actually do squat. So if you compare weaker people to stronger people, what people can produce in isolation outside of the squat, what weaker people can produce in isolation outside of the squat is greater than what stronger people can produce in the squat itself. So it could be a coordination thing, but it does say, at least to some extent, people have the ability to produce the spinal extension moments necessary to squat more.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
And with that research study, like it was hard because, as I know now, some people relatively stronger knee extensors, some people have relatively stronger hip extensors. So how I see it is like the back is like the last resort in the chain. So the weakest link's going to approach failure first. We're going to shift loading demands to the next muscle group. So if you think you go from the knee to the hip, and then the hip gets to the point where it can't do the job, so it goes to the back. So, when it comes to the back extensor strength being kind of that, that significant correlation that we found, maybe it's not causation, it's just that everyone's last resort is the back. And that's why it only ended up being that significant determining factor in back squat strength. If you look at maybe individual basis, some people are very balanced between the muscle groups, because we looked at, when they were the very, I can't even remember, was it a max? It was like you were getting them to max out quite a bit, or like right around their max. So like some people, it maybe, they transferred all their loading to the hip, and then they had to go to their lower back. And then other people, they went from their hip to their knee, and they were super upright, but then last resort with their lower back. So I think it's the last link in the chain where loading can be transferred to and the compensation happens. So that's why I think it's that significant thing. But like Andrew said, we have enough strength to be able to handle more weight on the bar. It's just the other joints can't do it. And that's why. And I think that's why it's correlation, but not causation.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think all of the strength variables were correlated in our study with squat strength, which you'd probably kind of expect.
Yeah. Muscle mass. Yeah. We expect that. The more muscle mass you have, the more you can squat. Yeah.
Omar. I'm sorry, Andrew.
Yeah. Just one last thing. So also with the spinal motion, it's quite difficult to conceptualize, because if you look at some of the studies that actually look at spinal motion during the squat or in other multi-joint movements. So for example, I published a study in 2015 that looked at the good morning, and you always see lumbar spine flexion, even if people look like they're like perfectly neutral or an extension. So there could be motion at some segments, but not others. Like, for example, the lower lumbar spine, but not the upper lumbar spine, or maybe not the thoracic spine. So kind of what you see or what you notice isn't everything that's going on. So it kind of makes the interpretation of these things somewhat difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So according to Stu McGill, everyone is going to break all the time, is what I just heard. You can't have flexion in the spine, okay? So, all right. Man, we're going to get sued after this episode, Omar.
It's our, Eric, I said that you were going to say our last episode and announce it. I think I should just announce it right now that this is our last one, just so no one could come after us after this. We don't have to make a response. When someone does a mic drop, you don't pick the mic back up.
That's right. We should just say every episode is our last, and therefore we
no
can
one's
just
gonna
keep not having to kick the can down the road. Exactly.
I think there's digs that you guys are giving that are still even over my head. So I'm sure it's actually worse than it's coming across to me.
Oh,
it's perfect.
Sorry, my mind's still going through my last thought. There's one more thing I could add to that. So like Megan mentioned, when you're in a neutral position, the sarcomeres of the spinal extensors are in a somewhat shortened position. So that means if you flex a little bit, they become closer to neutral or optimal length. So perhaps to some extent, a little bit of flexion is okay. A little bit of flexion there's no problem with it. It's perhaps a stronger position. So not only is it normal, but it might even be optimal to some extent.
I think that's valuable perspective that definitely goes against some of the norms of what we're taught.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, they should read Sam Ward's research.
And that goes
Shout
back
out Sam
to
Ward.
some people can lift with a bit of a rounded back, but they don't get hurt, while others do. You know, is it because of the back, or is it stemming from the pelvis? Is it coming from here? It's so multifactorial.
Yeah, and it could be that some people are rounding from the thoracic spine versus a ton from the lumbar, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Eric,
Absolutely.
if only we had these two on for the was it the pain science? That technique is not a great indicator of anything when it comes to injury risk. Some of these conversations would be interesting, and I'd be remiss because Eric, let's face it, man. Powerlifting, strength training. Well, yes, it might be intellectually invigorating. Bodybuilding spiritually is where you find the fulfillment. I'm so close to asking Andrew about winning the hypertrophies, but to be frank, I found this conversation very interesting, and I almost feel like there should be two parts, because there are things to follow up that we spoke about in the last like 20 or 30 minutes. I just quickly want to go over, and one of them would be if we could jump back about 20 to 30 minutes when we're talking about myofascial release. And what we said, Eric, before on another episode about the bleeding edge of science, where it is kind of rife with pseudoscience. And we had Dr. Gabrielle Fondaro talking about gut health and how that's kind of an area where people will make outlandish claims, but it doesn't prevent the possibility in this instance, which is very, I could say, refreshing to see two individuals willing to state or theorize on things that the evidence hasn't conclusively been given when it comes to the papers, when it comes to the research, where I think sometimes people are almost too afraid, where, you know, I'm risking my reputation by saying this. You mean I'm later going to have to recant this? And some people, you know, on the other hand, are willing to die on their sword. I think when we talk about that myofascial release, what I think in my head were what I witnessed was, I would say, some well-reasoned thinking that could it be true? Very potentially. Could also not be true. There's also that possibility. But you see in instances in the space where you said, Megan, I'm thinking about people where they talk about the fascia, that there's an individual where you said, you know, what's a foam roller going to do once you've done cadavers? There's actually an individual, and I say, Eric, I'm saying individual so we don't get sued, that sells basically 130-pound steel cylinders, and his rationale for the transient changes, Andrew, of like, oh, like you do this and you feel a little bit, well, you're just not going deep enough. So like this foam roller, you know, it's quite light. You see on your body, you need 130 pounds, and so there's a marked difference between going down that rabbit hole and then what we're talking about. So I just wanted to give both of you props and the willingness to discuss something openly. That once again, I think there's kind of that intellectual checkmark where people are too afraid to be wrong. In an instance, if they're trying to theorize something. And then the second thing I did want to say, and I wanted to maybe get the opinion of the guests, because the hypertrophies, Eric, it's on my mind. I'm thinking of Andrew's biceps, but I got to talk about this. There's survivorship bias potentially of falling into a school of thought. And what I mean when I say that, like, oh, this is going to work for me, where you see a select group, and that select group, you think to yourself, oh, maybe that's the answer. So let's take weightlifters as an example, right? Is it their training that they're doing that's producing those adaptations, or the individuals at the highest level of proficiency, they have that natural propensity, their body shape, the proportions, let's say, where their torsos are longer, their femurs are a little bit shorter, so they can remain more upright. So we see these people at the very end, like the best, no shit, they tend to kind of look, they're a little more homogenous in terms of their body type and how they look. And so you see these individuals squatting really upright, and it's like, well, wait a second, they got jumbo quads, and they squat high bar, and they squat a lot. Therefore, maybe that's what I should be doing, rather than it's like they survived. They were the ones that this type of training, because naturally they're good at it, they're going to excel. We're going to see the end consequence of all that. They're the strongest in a high bar position. That might not be me right now. And then once again, the same idea maybe can be said about the low bar zealots, you know, where individuals like, this is the only way to do things. And I think what I want to open up to prevent us from that bias where, you know, kind of maybe even aesthetically, the look of the lift, we think like, oh, that's me right there. You know, like I'm a sumo boy, because that's like, you know, it's the coolest in thing to do. It's kind of crisp, it's clean. I see everyone else. The question I would pose for both of you, and I don't know who wants to start it, is, you know, let's assume, Megan, they can't access kinetic advantage. Let's assume, okay, they're being cheap, Andrew. They don't have that resource, but they want to start optimizing for themselves, and they don't want to make some of those critical thinking mistakes. Like, oh, I saw this guy make it. squat this way or bench this way or deadlift this way, therefore I should do this, or the kind of guru system where once again they need a one size fits all because they need that authority to seem like they have all the answers. How does one start navigating their own body? And I know that sounds really deep, but I'm talking specifically now when it comes to getting stronger. So I don't know where we're going to open up to, but I just want to kind of explore that a little bit before, yes, we talk about the hypertrophies.
Okay, I'll start before I lose what I wanted to say in my head, because I'll forget. My mom brain is really bad lately. So when you're talking about the people who excel, I immediately think about gymnastics. And for years, they thought that, it stunted your growth, but it was actually I say lifters, the gymnasts who were shorter in stature that ended up excelling because they had a mechanical advantage to perform the movements. So it's absolutely true on that. When it comes to that one size fits all, I think it gives people, it's that simpleness. It gives people direction because it is so, and that's what I try to do. I try to give people direction, but people need to understand that everyone's direction is pointing in a different direction. Everyone is so different, and it just depends on that individual and, what their strengths and weaknesses are. So, I had this conversation about, I don't know if I'm bringing up a trigger for people, but, conjugate training. And there's different ways of using it. And, some trainers, they think that you're going to do all of your accessories. But if you're doing all accessories, you're not practicing your competition style. Or if you choose accessory movements that hit every single muscle group, then that's going to work. But what I've seen is that lifters will always do what's easiest. So if you prescribe a bunch of accessory movements and you're really into that, like conjugate training, then probably all of your accessory movements you're doing are actually training your stronger muscle group. Because if you got really strong hips and then my better example is if you got really strong quads and you try to do a box squat, you're probably going to be even more upright, like to a partial range of motion. You're going to push your knees forward more. Your body's always going to try to take advantage of your stronger muscle group. And so, yeah, you might be doing box squats to try and hit your hip extensors, but if you don't know any better about technique and, leverages and, your technique influences the muscle contributions, you're probably still just training your stronger muscle group to a certain extent. So whenever, if they don't have access to me or, they don't know, I think of it as like, if you really love an exercise, an accessory exercise, it's probably the one that you shouldn't be doing because your body likes to do it because it's taking advantage of your stronger muscle group. So I'm very it seems like I'm anti everything, but it's more like I was out of the realm of powerlifting for a while. So I didn't even know I don't know what half these things are and half these niches are. So I'm just coming in with maybe a more objective view, and people will throw out this name out there about something. And I'm like, oh yeah, this, I just didn't realize there was a name for it. So I'm kind of abandoning all kind of niches, and I'm saying just do what your body's meant to do. Take advantage of your strengths, identify your strengths, because if you're really good at front squats and they're pretty close to your back squat, it's probably because you got strong quads and you should be hitting your relatively weaker muscle group. And whenever you're trying to choose an exercise to hit that weaker muscle group, you should be over accentuating it to try and provide that mechanical disadvantage because it's weak for a reason. Your body's going to fight against you. So you got to push those hips back more if you're wanting to take advantage of your hip extensors, or you got to push those knees forwards more. You have to go deep. Again, it's not that clear cut. People don't kind of pigeonhole yourself. If that's the kind of the best advice I can give, it's about learning how to think critically and think critically on your own. Yes, it's easier just to follow someone, but that person probably developed it and it benefited them because it benefited their body or it benefited a couple of their lifters. And then unfortunately, when it doesn't work for a lifter that isn't designed to benefit from it, they get blamed that, oh, you weren't training properly, or you weren't trying hard enough, or you weren't doing it properly. People are, a little bit biased to, like I said, when you're threatening their identity, they react. I'm sure I've threatened some people's identity without even realizing it. So if I have, I apologize, everyone. I do completely naive. So yeah, Andrew, if you want to add on to that.
I don't know if I have much to add. I mean, I don't work very closely with the applied aspects of these things, and I don't really give them too much thought anymore. So I don't. I can't address Omar's first point in that it's very easy if you don't really say anything.
If you don't have an Instagram account, it's way easier than if you have one and you're trying to get good information out there. So.
But yeah, I never really have to take a stance because I don't say anything substantive. So
you're above it all. I get it, Andrew.
I'm jealous, is what I am right there. Something you spoke to, I think both you, Omar, and then what you spoke to a bit there, Megan, is essentially reverse causality. When you look at a correlation, there could be a causal relationship between these two things. There might not. And if there is, you don't actually know which direction it goes. Mm-hmm. To use a non-powerlifting example, the whole epidemiological data showing higher instances of diet soda consumption in people with obesity. Mm-hmm. Is that causing them to be obese, or is it people with obesity are trying to lose weight, so they're consuming diet soda? I tend to think the latter, based on some of the RCTs that are out there. One that is hilarious, that is in the powerlifting world more specifically, are some of the Shaiko charts for how tall you are and therefore what weight class you should be in. And they're based off of the people who Shaiko's worked with and champion powerlifters who are at a certain height and therefore given body weight. And I look at it and I'm like, so myself, I could be a 105 at times if I've purposely gained some weight and don't do a cut, but I'd be like, 98 or 100 kilos are the heaviest. And almost all of my competitions have been done at 93 or 198, depending on the country and the weight class and the organization. And according to the chart, at 6 foot, I should be a super heavy. Period. And it's like, well, of course, the champion powerlifters who are 6 foot are going to have the bone structure and muscle mass to be able to be a high level super heavyweight, and that's where the totals are best at that height. But little old me has a total that would be good in the 74 kilo class or lower. And it may not be that I'm not heavy enough, but just that I'm not built to be a super heavyweight champion powerlifter.
You don't want to take some years off your life doing it and achieving that standard. And it goes back to that, the chart where...
Well, hold on.
We're talking about gold medals here.
If I could achieve a 900 kilo total, I'd shave a few years off my life because I am about that insanity. But I realistically don't think I could. So not to be short-sighted, but yeah, I just don't know that... I don't think I could get... There's not any level of obesity that would add 300 kilos to my total, I don't think, unless you actually counted the body weight I gained as part of my total. Mm-hmm. So
it kind of goes to the charts of if you have this proportion, you should be lifting sumo versus conventional or wide squat or low bar or high bar. And I've gotten to the point where I've worked with enough lifters now where, okay, if you have someone with really long legs, then they should be like sumo, or they should be low bar and not high bar, because if they're high bar they have to push their knees forward even more, and because they got those long legs. And I've actually had lifters where you look at them and you're like, no way, like they could squat high bar, and then their relatively stronger muscle group is their knee extensors, and as soon as you get them to try and go low bar, they can't do it because their glutes just aren't up to par with it. So yes, mechanically those charts make sense, but neuromechanically, neuromusculoskeletal mechanically, it's not a one fit thing. Like it doesn't fit everyone. But I think people, they get satisfaction and they just want a simple answer, and that is what they'll go to. Initially, because it's a simple direction to go to, and I'm going to use this and it tells me what to do. It's a lot easier for someone to tell you what to do, and That's why even like high level powerlifters, they need coaches, right? They coach people, but they need someone to just kind of take their hand and lead them. And sometimes that is a good thing if you have a good mentor. And sometimes it's a bad thing if you have a poor mentor who is, needless to say, intellectually dishonest, and they're that stubborn mule that won't open their eyes to new information. And they're very stuck on a research study from 10 years ago that, things have developed since then, update, and they're like, nope, squatting deep's bad for your knees, and different things like that, despite all the new evidence and information out there that just speaking to the people that I have to fight with.
Well said. So let's talk about some of the things we can actually do. So hypothetically, you've done a analysis of someone's lifts, and you want to give them some cues to actually change their lifts. What might that look like, and how do you decide what to give them?
So whenever I do an assessment, I use Dartfish. It's like a visual tool. It's kind of like convince them on what I'm saying, so they can, not just, it's not, I could tell you what to do, but to show you is a lot better. And I find, and what I love most is when my lifters start talking like me. It's like I'm building my dynasty, and they're, I'm making a change, and they're like, oh, like I looked at this, and like my definitely looked, like I was using my knee extensors, my quads good, and that just like puts the biggest smile on my face. So I like to demonstrate visually so that they can learn from it. And I track the bar and the hip and the shoulder, torso angle. It just depends on the lifter, and it's not that every assessment looks the exact same. It's I look at it and I watch the videos, and then I choose the visual feedback based on what I think they will get the most out of it. But I like to demonstrate, if their knees are staying forward, do their knees shoot back? I educate them on, how muscles contribute in different portions of the lift. So if, say, the knee extensors are that make it or break it muscle group in the deeper position, and they're failing in that position, or they're having this extreme amount of compensation in that position, then that is where I'm visually demonstrating it to them and saying that, this is because the quads can't do the job, and we're transferring loading, or we're just completely failing. And then, some people would say, oh, I'm good morning squat up because my knee extensors are weak. So my cue is to, drive your shoulders back, or, get a big chest. But, that in itself is another compensation, because you're trying to use your erectors to do the movements, the glutes. And when you've just transferred all of your loading to the glutes. So I don't really like to cue that much. I find with the deadlift, it's a little different because it's more technical than the squat. The squat is this basic, human movement that we've just ruined over centuries. And, a lot of the research, and, I've looked at the neurophys of it, and the anatomy of it, and the biomechanics of it. And I actually pull from geriatric research with sit to stand research. And it comes down to that your relative strength is going to depict how you stand up from a chair. And so if one muscle group isn't strong enough, it's, you're going to do this, and your body's going to fight against, whatever cue you're going to use. Maybe the chest up cue works at, a lighter load, but as soon as you get heavy, the body's just going to take over. It's going to take the wheel, and cues are only going to go so far. So squat, I don't cue. I say, okay, you move this way. Let's bring up the strength and of this muscle group, and this is how you're going to monitor it, or we'll work like on a monthly or bi-weekly basis and continually monitoring it. But then, preventing them from going to the other extreme. But it's then choosing the exercises that are going to bring up their weakness. So if their knee extensors are their weaker one, then we do movements like Frankenstein squats. Like I don't even get them to do front squats right away if it's really bad. I make them do Frankenstein squats, and I tell them to squat ass to grass, because the Frankenstein squat is the arm straight out in front version of a front squat. And if they have a posterior hip shift and the knees shoot back, and they try to transfer any loading demands, the bar is going to fall over. So it's like the best multi-joint way of isolating the quads without actually doing like a leg extension that's not going to transfer over very well. But it's kind of like fighting against their body, what it wants to do to bring up the strength of it. And we choose exercises like that provide the mechanical disadvantage for the weaker muscle group. And then we monitor continuously. And one exercise doesn't work for another lifter. When it comes to the glutes, they're so finicky. It's like this cue will work for one lifter to help them engage them better. This one, it won't. This lifter, I have to tell them to keep their weight on their midfoot so they can hip hinge better. This lifter, I have to tell them to, keep the shoulders over their midfoot. Everyone is just so different, but it just comes down to address the weakness and let the rest evolve, basically.
Man, there's some really good things in there I want to highlight. I think for one, you challenged me in two ways. The first challenge was that the answer wasn't just to yell hips at people, which we know is the universal powerlifting cue.
What does that even
on
mean?
Anything except for the bench press. Hit, Megan, come on, hips, right?
Yeah, I've yelled it too. I've done it.
I think it's almost like just an emotional reaction. Like you just yell it when you want someone to make a lift. I basically take it as some kind of positive affirmation for the person at this point because it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
The other thing I think is really, really interesting that you said is because most powerlifters would say something like the squat is the more technically demanding lift than the deadlift, because deadlift you're just picking some off the ground. But I think your background of researching sit to stand and like elderly people, and that's something, one of the first things we learn as a toddler before we start trying to walk and stuff like that is how to actually get in the position where you can start walking is an interesting perspective. And that there is even specifics of the approach you take with different lifts. So I think that's really interesting. The other really interesting thing you said is how cueing is not necessarily like the end all be all. And you prefer, and correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth, exercises that essentially force the person to work towards their weaknesses instead of favoring their strengths. That's something that is actually really common in weightlifting, and I think it's a more obvious and apparent strategy that's emerged from the more technical demands of the lifts and the fact that they're engaging more complete and multiple aspects of a movement pattern with more joints involved. Like if someone is really bad at getting under the bar, well, you don't give them the big pull. They have to start basically at the hip. And so something like a Frankenstein squat makes a lot of sense. I think the one thing, given you challenged me so much, I'd like to challenge you slightly, is with cues, there's a fair amount of research. And Andrew, I'd love to get your thoughts, knowing that you have some of the motor pattern strengths on your side. Some of the research on cueing would suggest that internal cues, focusing on specific muscles or moving your body in space, might be inferior to, say, an external cue, which we typically conceive of as something that's not within your body, trying to push the floor away, for example, instead of yelling hips at them. When is it appropriate to use an internal versus external cue? Should we always just not do internal cues? And how does that come into your calculus when you start working with people?
So there was actually a brand new study that came out looking at internal versus external cues during the deadlift, and they found that an external cue, what it was only beneficial for in the deadlift was improved stability. So like the center pressure sway helped. So I know that so I did a research study that we basically put this big wall in front of the people while they stood quietly, just stood still, not as still as possible, but just, quiet standing, not moving and fidgeting. And we found that when the wall was in front of them, they were more stable. So you're constantly using all these, all the sensory information from the environment, and you need to rely on your somatosensory, your muscle sense, your pressure distribution on your foot. The squat is a really challenging balance task that we don't really realize. And then you're using your visual and your inner ear. So I think with the external cues, maybe it helps you reweight onto the external environment more visually. Because if you're accelerating, you're kind of messing up your vestibular sense. Maybe that's being a little conflicting. Or if you're fatiguing and things are tight, then maybe your, somatosensory input is not as reliable. So maybe that has something to do with it, but I think it has to do with, providing some stability there. And if we're prioritizing the goal of the task and moving the bar up, you're going to use a very different muscle strategy than if you're prioritizing not trying to fall over. You know what I mean? And so if you're not trying to fall over, you're probably have increased joint rigidity, and and that's extra energy being wasted. So the internal versus external, I find internal works really well with people who are trying to engage their glutes better for some reason. I can't explain it. So when they're focusing on their glutes, if like I say, I need you to actually use them on the way down, don't just bounce out of the hole with your quads. Like I need you to brace your pelvis with your glutes. That internal cue will work. If I say like sit into them kind of like a hammock, there's cues like that. But it's not going to depict like how they come up out of the squat. I find it's just if their glutes are contributing, or if they're using their adductor magnus or their hamstrings. I find with women with bracing and pelvic floor dysfunction, I don't even know how you categorize them. So like I tell women if they have problems with urinary incontinence, if they're bearing down and they're peeing on the platform, I tell them to start screaming. Like, is that an internal or external cue? Because whenever you do the right, your pelvic floor lifts and it contracts, and your abs come in, and you're actually bracing your torso with your transverse abdominis, and like you're getting the full 360 bracing, and instead of belly being like a balloon and it being pushed out, and the pressure's got to go somewhere, and it goes down on their pelvic floor. So that is, I don't know, is it internal, external, yelling, but causes an internal response? Another cue, it's like if I say, pretend your abs are hot dog buns and you're trying to close them up. Like there's different, like those cues work really well for, I find, bracing. But when it's like the multi-joint level scale, like the total sum of everything working together, that's when I find external is more important. Like pushing the world down is an external versus squeezing your quads to right. Do the movement. So I think it's there's definitely different situations, and I'm not sure what is 100% the best. It's not my area of expertise, and I'll have to say that I'm fully willing to admit when I don't know, but I will give you my best educated answer that I can produce.
Respect. That's all I think there is something to be said for what the why behind internal and external cueing. And in my mind, like you said, when you're giving someone a complex multi-joint task and you ask them to focus on one specific muscle group and what is contributing to the whole thing, because you think that's the one that's not doing it, that's a very, very simplistic way of looking at it that might have negative second or third order effects. But if you give them what might technically be a internal cue that results in some other behavior that is not directly what you're trying to happen, like if it's an indirect effect that changes the motor pattern, then that's kind of trying to accomplish the same thing that an external cue might do, even though it would technically fall under the category of internal. So I think that's a more nuanced understanding that you gave. Andrew, give us some of your thoughts on how this stuff plays out.
So I'll play off of Megan's "it depends." So, just broadly speaking, from the literature that I know, there's not much on actual longitudinal adaptations with internal versus external cues. There was a study that I published with Brad Schoenfeld a couple of years ago on hypertrophy and strength. But other than that, I can't really think of too many studies. And that's the whole thing with a literature and a ton of area in exercise and sports sciences, and that will, let's say, give someone an internal versus external cue for a vertical jump or squat or something like that, and just look to see how that affects their performance within a session. But I think oftentimes the more interesting question in exercise science is, what is the effect on the actual adaptation? And that is oftentimes very ambiguous relative to the acute change that goes on. So I don't know.
Oh my God, Andrew does know something.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense to me, because we talked about this earlier. Megan, you stated how any technique change will initially elicit a performance decrement in someone who's trained, at least. So if your whole life, since you're a little kid, you jumped, and you come into a lab and someone says, "Hey, stand on this force plate, and I want you to jump," They go, sweet. Now, if they stand on the force plane, you go, no, I want you to think about your quads contracting while you jump. You're going to be like, wait, what? I think it would only mess up your motor pattern initially. So conclusions on that, like you said, may only apply for the first couple times you do that until that becomes something integrated as part of what you do. And I think that's a really good point, and something we should never forget, that acute does not necessarily translate directly to longitudinal.
And just because something's used as a sort of training cue doesn't mean it has to be used as an execution in an actual competition, let's say. So something could confer an advantage even if it's not directly used in the competition itself. So via adaptation.
Yeah, like if you say we need to make sure we're hitting your hips more, that means push your hips back more. But then I say, don't do that in your squat, your competition squat though. Like maybe a better cue for them, or like for a lifter whose hips, they shoot back out of the hole, and the coach is yelling hips, 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 and they're like, but I've just put all the loading on my hips and they're already maximally activated. That's why I'm in this sticking point as is, and you're telling me to contract them even more. So I say just go, like a better cue is knees forward, because it gets your quads back into the game, and it just reduces the distance between your hip and the bar a lot more effectively than if you were just like, oh, just squeeze your glutes a little bit more and that'll achieve it, even though, so there's different cues for it. It goes down to what is the goal of the task? Is it to isolate this muscle group, or is it to, is it more, whole scale move a bar that's not even attached to your body, it's just sitting on it?
Yeah. I think
totally makes sense.
I think, Eric, we are forgetting the best cue, and the cue that always works, and that is just up. I mean, how can you forget a powerlifting meet where people just yell up, 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 up? It's like, okay, thanks, man.
They might as well just be like going, like just screaming.
Yeah. I love how that one is so ubiquitous.
Up, you're supporting their intention they're already doing. Yeah. They're saying, I want you to go up.
Strong verbal encouragement has scientifically been shown to increase, muscle activation levels and force output. So it doesn't really matter what you're saying. Like I worked in a French lab in Ottawa, and I do understand French, but I'm not good at speaking it because I don't practice it. I understand it, and we had English research participants come in, we had French ones, but all the researchers kept yelling was allez, 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 allez. Like it means go, 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 go. So for the fatigue study, so like it sounds cool, allez, 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 and like, but does that even mean anything to the participant? No, but it was encouraging and it helped them get through it.
That is the exercise science lab experience. Is you might be working at your desk, and then intermittently every 3 minutes you hear 15 people who are progressively saying it a little less in a genuine sense. It starts with go, 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 and by the end it's go, 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 go. I've been here 8 hours. Why am I doing a PhD? Yeah, absolutely. Love it. So we've talked about using accessory movements that basically reward or punish the pattern you're trying to get to. So they're not specifically targeting given muscle groups. They're not just kind of random so that you end up targeting your strengths. We've talked about how cues are issue specific, lift specific. And you also talked about compensation, which in essence comes down to the problem you might see. Like, for example, thinking the back is the weak point when you mentioned earlier, it's the last line of defense. The problem came much before that. I think that's something that I see happening in powerlifting when people do like sticking point training or trying to train a sticking region. I always try to explain it to people like, when you slam on the brakes of a car, you don't stop immediately. Your car slows down when it comes to the stopping point. And what the analogy there I'm trying to create is that the issue, the point at which you started to produce less velocity was there. And the point at which you stop, which is what I think most powerlifters do, they're trying to train the point where they get stuck, not maybe what the initial cause was. And it's very difficult to see what's actually happening. So are sticking points something you address in your analysis? How do you analyze them? Or is that kind of a folly to even approach?
So I look, where they fail more specifically. So if they fail in the higher portions of the lift, that's where the hip extensors are the, make it or break it muscle group. Then, I look at the hips more. That's kind of like my first, piece of the puzzle. If it's in the bottom positions, it's highly likely the quads are just not able to produce enough torque at the knee. And then with the bench press, it can get a little bit more messy, and it's the same with the squat and the deadlift. But if you think about, the most efficient bar path is a back and then up one, right? Getting it over your face. So the first zone, so a couple inches off the chest is the make it or break it muscle group. The higher regions, it's the triceps, and then it's a sliding scale where they kind of trade off in their roles. And so the sticking point in the bench does happen around that trade-off zone. But if we were to say that, okay, if I'm failing in the higher portions of the lift where the triceps, are responsible for lockout, it must be my triceps are the relatively weaker muscle group. But if the lifter used too much triceps off their chest because their chest was weak and they pushed straight up, and then they put their triceps in a very poor position to finish off the lockout, then that's where it gets a little bit messy. It depends on, you have to look at where their sticking point is and then look at their body orientation with respect to the bar. If the lifter pushed back and up off their chest very effectively, and the triceps in the delts are in this really mechanically advantageous position to lock out the bar, and then they fail, then okay, yeah, I'd say their triceps are relatively weaker. Same thing with the squat. If you transferred all this loading from the knee to the hip and you did this good morning squat up, but then you failed in the higher positions, it's not because the glutes are relatively weaker, it's because they just took up all this loading to have to do all the work. Same with the lower back, and then that's where you failed in that position. So it's again, and it depends. And it's just looking at, okay, why does the sticking point happen and how are they positioned in it? And then you identify, okay, they're in the sticking point because they're trying to put all that loading on that muscle group, or they're in the sticking point because the muscle just can't do its job. And that's where you go to prescribing the accessory movements.
Makes sense. Andrew, any thoughts on sticking movements between people, the way they typically think about it, what might actually be happening?
I don't think I have a whole lot to add. Perhaps one thing to note is just that, so the entire basis of our study that we released several years ago was, if we look at someone at their actual sticking point or during a 1 rep max, based off their joint angles at that point in the lift, can we then draw better relationships as to what the weak point of that individual is? So for example, if their knee extensors are at a certain angle, or if their knees at a certain angle, their hips at a certain angle, backs at a certain angle, will we then better understand their maximum strength by looking at the strength of their individual joints at that sticking region? And it doesn't seem completely clear to me that there's any single joint that's of interest. And also, I mean, like you said in the beginning of this, the squat is a movement that occurs in time. So it's necessarily dependent on the previous time point. So what you do early on, and let's say the phase where you start moving up, that may lead you to a situation where you just get to a point where that you can't recover from. So it's not necessarily the point at which you stick that's the issue, or the point at which you fail. There's a history dependence there.
That's a very good way of putting it. You put it a lot more simple than my 10 minutes of ranting. So thank you, Andrew.
And this is why we have panels. Yeah. So is there any value in maybe assessing the point at which velocity starts slowing in a lift rather than the point at which the bar stops?
I think of it as
my
like
follow-up question.
Piece of the puzzle, right? It's not the end all of, what we need to be doing to improve that sticking point. It's just a piece of the puzzle. And then I just really like to look at load effects or fatigue effects. So if the muscle group is working a lot harder, then, whether you add more load to the bar or, reps go on, it's going to accumulate fatigue quicker, or, it can't produce as much force output if we add more load to the bar. So the same kind of compensation might happen. I don't look at specifically the sticking points. I look at how they may or may not change as load is increased or the reps go on, so that we can see the compensation. There's so many degrees of freedom to take advantage of. Like I'll use this muscle, or no, I'm going to use this muscle this time. It's just so many different things to take into account.
Absolutely. I think we've covered a lot. I want to give Omar any chance of stuff that you might want to bring up before we then give the floor to our guests to see what they might want to capstone this off with.
No, don't do it, Eric, because we've kept our guests now for almost 2.5 hours. We could go on. I think, I know Andrew's doing his PhD, but I think we can have almost a follow-up. Because, I was thinking in my head when we were first talking about strength training or positions as it relates to strength that, we got to talk about the hypertrophies, how that influences things like movements and muscles and the connection therein. And then trying to optimize one's physique using those movements and the differences that we can kind of alter in that. But that's a whole other rabbit hole, bro. I think we've spoken about so much, and I think it's been action packed. I think we've literally attacked everyone that we could in this episode. So
and I don't even know it.
Yeah, from just a controversial standpoint, I think this episode's going to do well if we just label it like slaying the gurus and then put in brackets some of them. So I'm thrilled. Our marketing manager, I've been getting the feedback as he's listening to these things, said this one, and I quote from him, is a sizzler. So I'm good, man. Yeah, I won't press it further.
Awesome. Well, I greatly appreciate the fictional marketing manager's input on the fictional headphone you've got in there that's actually just plugged into your computer. Yep. But always
it's
good
just
to have
schizophrenia.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Early stages. So not early harmful stages, yet.
Still functional.
Yeah, it does not require medical intervention, is what I tell myself, actually. Yeah.
Quite literally.
Yeah.
So, anything else that you two want to add that we might have glossed over as a key piece that you think is important before we finish this sucker out? And again, thank you very much both for your time.
I have problems coming up with things on the top of my head. I've realized that I have a lot of random information. And sometimes I get nervous with these podcasts, like, oh, maybe I don't know the topic. And then somehow I keep pulling this random, thing that I was told at some conference, or that one mentor told me, or I learned in one situation. So I think we've covered pretty much everything. It's like I said, I spread my expertise wide, and then as a result, I'm mediocre at everything, but not good at one specific thing.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and challenge you as a doctor in mediocreness as it relates to exercise science, strength conditioning. We cover every Venn diagram a little bit, but never get any depth. I think you did well. I think your what might have felt like random was quite well responded to our specific questions, and certainly was helpful to listeners who maybe had some tropes in their head about powerlifting and biomechanics that I think you cleared up. And hopefully we institute a little more critical thinking, humility, and people not to self-select into these hardcore schools of thought that give them too much rigidity and maybe think, well, I've been trying to do sumo because of my limb lengths, and they don't actually know that they have very, let's say, deep hip sockets, just can't get into that position. And maybe now they'll even try conventional and hit some PRs because of you. So much thanks. Andrew, anything else you want to
add? Just to build off what you were saying, I guess, and actually some of the things that Megan was mentioning earlier, a lot of these anthropometric and things that are traditionally thought to be biomechanical things are there's a difference between a strength and constraint. So just because something is a constraint doesn't mean that the opposite is your strength, or vice versa. So everybody's going to have their kind of own little edge on this highly multi-dimensional area. That's probably the best for them. And whether or not that's very, very close to where their constraint is, or whether or not it's close to where their strength is in one dimension, is kind of unclear. So these are kind of difficult problems, and this is also a dynamical system, so things are complicated. So it's hard to give basic heuristics, I think. So just appreciating the individual, how individual these things are, I think will help from an applied aspect.
Well said, sir. Thank you very much both for your time. Megan, welcome to the Iron Culture. We'll probably have you back, as Omar suggested, so long as you'll actually be willing. And I know you won't say it on air, but via email. That took too much damn time. I'm a mother. You didn't respect my time.
Yeah.
Totally understandable. And we
My
may never
husband's
see you
pissed
again,
at
but we
me.
hope to.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Just throw us under the bus. That's what Omar and I are here for.
Yep.
And with that, Omar, can you please close us out?
Thank you. Yeah, and Eric, I just want to echo what you said. Because we are the sole owners of our own culture and we communicate to our followers, you will not be given a voice to give your side of the story. So they'll only hear one side, which is the right side. Sure, we may have said at the start of this episode before we went on air, guys, we're going to be on for 90 minutes to 2 hours. That's typically what we go in for. So we really appreciate you agreeing to do this. And yeah, we may have gone over by 30 minutes. And yes, Andrew, you might be doing a PhD. Megan, you might have a life. You might have a husband outside that's waiting. But the cult comes first. And that's probably the lasting impression I want to impart upon everyone is that we just appreciate their support. We appreciate them listening all the way to the end. They can help us by leaving a rating and review. I feel almost embarrassed to list some of the, Eric, some of our contemporaries, that we compete against. But needless to say, it's a dog-eat-dog world. Our OnlyFans account is not flourishing. GoFundMe isn't what it used to be. So a rating review can literally make or break our careers. And if you're on YouTube, go ahead and leave a comment. We'll do our best to respond. We're back every single Monday from now until eternity.